So now we're here in the ancient city of Smyrna, and we're talking about Revelation 2, verses 8 and following. We're talking about the persecuted church. In the book, The Insanity of God, the author, who simply goes by the name Nick, talks about a time when he went back into the Soviet Union shortly after it collapsed. And there he was interviewing pastors, evangelists, and other believers. And what he kept hearing was how they had suffered for Jesus, many of them imprisoned for years at a time, others beaten and tortured. And as he listened to their stories, he wondered why they didn't publish these stories and make movies about them. And the believers there couldn't understand why he thought that was such a big deal. And one of the older men understood what was going on, and he asked Nick to come over and look out the window. And he said to him, "Nick, how many times have you said to your boys in the morning, 'Come with me, look out the window, watch, and you'll see the sun is going to rise'?" And Nick thought about it, and he laughed, and he said, "I've never done that." And the old man asked him why. He says, "Well, because the sun always comes up. It's not like an event to take note of." And the old man said, "Well, that's why we don't make a big deal out of the persecution. It's just like the sun coming up. We expect it. We know it's going to happen." In a similar kind of a way, believers all around the world have come to know and expect persecution. It's as normal as the sun coming up. Of course, as Christians in the West, that's not a reality for us at any kind of severe way, as it's been for many other Christians throughout the ages. But it is possible that this could be very much a part of our future. The author George Orwell said that the further a society drifts from the truth, the more it hates those who speak it. And I think all of us can agree in the West that our society is not drifting closer to truth, but further away from it. And so the likelihood of persecution is certainly growing. And to the persecuted church in this passage, Jesus has three words of encouragement for us to hear. And the first word he says is to take comfort. To take comfort. He knows their pain. In verse 9, Jesus says to the church in Smyrna, "I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say they are Jews but are not, but are a synagogue of Satan." Jesus knows what they're going through and the tribulation they're suffering. Now, the tribulation of the believers here in Smyrna had to do with the fact that they were originally protected under the umbrella of Judaism from persecution for not worshiping the emperor. The Jews weren't required to worship the emperor because they had a long history of monotheism. Christians were first seen as a sect of Judaism. Eventually, the Jews in some places, didn't want the Christians to enjoy the same protections that the Jewish people enjoyed. And so they began to say to the Romans, these are not Jews, and the consequence is they should also be worshiping the Roman emperors. And if they weren't, they would experience persecution for it. So some of them physically suffered. Perhaps nearly all of them suffered financially because, again, just like in Pergamum, to really be able to participate in the economic system, one had to be willing to be a part of worshiping and sacrificing to the emperor. It was just a part of everyday life. Not to mention the fact many of these Christians were poor because they'd started poor to begin with. Christianity has always been attractive to those who are less materially wealthy. But to this poor church, through just circumstances and through persecution, Jesus says, "You are rich." To the church of Laodicea, they thought they were rich, but Jesus said they're poor. To the Smyrna church, they were poor, but Jesus says they're rich. And the reason why they're rich is because they shared in the fellowship of His sufferings. It's an experience, it's a richness that only the persecuted church can truly understand and appreciate, but it's one that we in the West ought to we shouldn't feel sorry for them, but perhaps sorry for ourselves, that we have not yet understood what this union with Jesus actually is like to the fullest extent of those who've shared in His suffering. Jesus describes them in verse 9 as the people who say that they are Jews, but they're actually a synagogue of Satan. These are similar to the words Jesus said directly to the Jewish people during His earthly ministry when He said, "You're of your father the devil." Those who claim to be God's people, but in fact turn over Christians for persecution, Jesus says, are not actually His people at all. So take comfort, He says to persecuted Christians, I know what you're going through. The second thing He says to us is to take courage. because more persecution is coming. That's probably not what the believers in Smyrna wanted to hear, but it was the reality. And so his first word to them is, do not fear, in verse 10. Do not fear what you're about to suffer. It's always amazing to me that Jesus says to people who are in life-threatening situations, he doesn't say it's time to panic. He doesn't say do what you can to try to protect yourself from what's coming. He says don't fear what's coming and don't fear what you're going to go through. Because when we're fearful, fear unchecked leads to cowardice, an unwillingness to do what obedience requires. And cowardice is not taken lightly. Jesus says elsewhere in the Gospels, he says, whoever acknowledges me before men, I will acknowledge, but he who denies me before men, I will also deny before my Father in heaven. Cowardiceness is a sin that Jesus takes very seriously, and we'll see that later on in Revelation. Second thing he wants them to remember is who's behind the persecution. In verse 10, he says, behold, the devil's about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you'll have tribulation. Jesus is sovereign over our persecution and suffering, but it is the devil who's directly behind it. Of his three tools, seduction, deception, the third one is persecution. So while persecution will be a trial and it will be a hardship, even that Jesus will work in and through for the good of his people. There's no need to fear. And then the third word he gives to them is be faithful unto death. It reminds me of the marriage vows that we take as Christians in the West, that we'll be faithful till death do us part. And in the same way, marriage points us to the faithfulness of Christ to his church, and the same kind of faithfulness that the church ought to express toward Jesus, that not even death, or all the way up until death, nothing will separate us from him. Now, if we're to be faithful all the way until death, then as Christians we ought to be faithful in everything less than death. Whether it costs us our freedom to follow Jesus, or our friends, or it costs us financially, even when it costs us our life, we are to be faithful to him. The third, before we even go on to the third piece, would be remiss not to talk about one of the early church fathers by the name of Polycarp, who was from right here in Smyrna. And around the time of AD 156, Polycarp, who had been a disciple of the Apostle John, was around 86 years old. And people said to him, when persecution began to become more intense here in the area, they said, why don't you just say Caesar is Lord? Why don't you just burn a little bit of incense to the emperor and save yourself suffering in your old age? And Polycarp said, I'm not going to do that. Well, later they came and arrested Polycarp, and they brought him to the stadium where he was told to renounce Jesus. And this is what Polycarp said. He said, for 86 years I have served Jesus, and he never once wronged me. How shall I blaspheme my King who saved me? And with these courageous words, Polycarp sealed his fate. He was burned at the stake right here, somewhere near where we're standing in Smyrna. And he stands as a testimony to us of what it looks like to be faithful unto death, whether that persecution happens in your 20s or your 80s, all the way to the end, we want to be faithful to Jesus. And so I just want to leave us with these three questions, perhaps, as we think about persecution. The first is, how many of us who say we would be willing to die with Jesus are not even willing to live for him? Someone once said that the world never burned a casual Christian at the stake. We don't ever have to worry about dying for Jesus if we're not living for him now. I can remember when talking to persecuted believers in one particular place, when they said, we can avoid persecution. All we have to do is not live boldly for Jesus. If we just simply stop telling people about Jesus, the persecution will stop. But they weren't willing to do that. They were committed to living for him all the way up to and including death. The second question is, have fear or insecurity prompted us to turn to other protectors than Jesus? Particularly for us in the West who have the ability to elect our political leaders, the fear of persecution may cause us to make political alliances with people that Christians ought to have no business dealing with. We shouldn't do that. we should be faithful to Jesus and know that by living for Jesus, persecution is a reality that we should expect. Thirdly, has a lack of persecution lulled us into complacency? When we think about our lives as Christians, again, particularly in the West, many of us have given up in our freedom what other Christians have refused to give up under persecution. How many of us will go days and weeks without reading our Bibles when Christians in the persecuted world wouldn't go a day without reading their Bible, even though reading their Bible may put their life at risk? Christians in the persecuted world won't stop sharing the gospel with people, even though they often do so at the risk of their very lives. But how easily and how complacent am I about sharing my faith when it doesn't cost me anything in the West? Believers in the persecuted world will gather together at the risk of their lives. But how many of us are unwilling to go to Sunday worship together with Christians because it's raining outside or just because we want to do something else? The persecuted church says to the Western world, don't give up in persecution or in freedom what we would never give up under persecution. The final words in this passage are that the crown of life is only for the victor. It's only for the one who remains faithful to the end. Jesus says in Revelation 21 that those who are cowards, along with the sexually immoral and the murderers and the sorcerers, those are the ones who will experience the second death. The first death is the death that we're all going to die in this world unless Jesus comes first. That's the death we're not to fear. The death we are to fear is the second death, the one that comes to those who, namely, are afraid of the first. But for those who overcome, through their faith in Jesus, remain faithful to Him to the end, they're promised a crown of life, that the second death won't ever touch them, that it's not something that we will have to fear because we'll have been delivered from it through Jesus' life and death and resurrection. Brothers and sisters, I hope that these words to the persecuted church are an encouragement to you to be faithful. And even if you haven't been, may the story of Peter be an encouragement to you. Just before Jesus died, Peter was unfaithful. He was a coward. 3 times he denied that he even knew Jesus. Yet the gospel writers go out of their way to tell us that Jesus not only forgave Peter, but He restored him. So even if we have been cowards and we've run from persecution or we've allowed it to, the fear of it to keep us from doing what we ought, Jesus promises forgiveness to those who repent. And we too can still expect, through faith in Him alone, to receive the crown of life. That's it for Smyrna.